You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for February 10th, 2023. This week, I'm going to talk about heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, both drugs and non-drug therapy, the search for atrial fibrillation, exercise as medicine, and a brief comment about the upcoming ACC. The first piece of news this week was that dapagliflozin was approved in Europe for any patient with heart failure. The European Commission has expanded the indication for dapagliflozin to include heart failure across the full spectrum of left ventricular ejection fraction, including heart failure with mildly reduced and preserved ejection fraction. The decision was largely made on the basis of the DELIVER trial. This was DAPA versus placebo in HFpEF. Now, I discussed this on the September 1st podcast about 5 months ago, but I think it's worth a brief relook again because my take is that the SGLT2 inhibitor drugs can provide substantial benefit, but that benefit turns on the underlying condition. Now, in diabetes, especially, and in CKD, and in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, the drugs are beneficial. But I find the results in HFpEF underwhelming. I'd be less worried about it if the drugs were not so costly, but they are costly. So DELIVER randomized about 6,000 patients with HFpEF, and the mean ejection fraction in these patients was 54%. The first point to make, and I think this is a really, really big teaching point when it comes to evidence translation, is the difference between inclusion and exclusion criteria of a trial and the actual characteristics of the enrolled patients. For DELIVER, you had to have an ejection fraction greater than 40%. That's the inclusion criteria. But the mean ejection fraction was far greater than that. The mean ejection fraction was 54%. Only about a third of patients had an ejection fraction between 40 and 49%, which again is almost normal. So in general, these ejection fractions were a lot higher than those in the HFrEF trials. These are different types of patients, HFrEF and HFpEF. Okay, a primary endpoint in DELIVER of CV death or heart failure event, and heart failure event could be a heart failure hospitalization or urgent visit for heart failure, occurred in 16.4% of the DAPA group versus 19.5% in the placebo arm. That absolute risk reduction of 3.1% and the hazard ratio or relative risk reduction was 0.82, which is an 18% relative risk reduction. It was statistically significant. But the driver of this primary endpoint, as it was in the emperor-preserved empagliflozin trial, was heart failure events, not CV death. One can say that in a trial of more than 6,000 patients carried on for more than 2 years, there were only 87 fewer heart failure events, and there were no significant differences in CV death or all-cause death. Now, I've spoken many times about the heart failure hospitalization being only a fraction of total hospitalization. I think it's a quite weak endpoint. You have to measure total hospitalizations because patients don't care why they're admitted to the hospital. And then for the quality of life assessment, the KCCQ questionnaire in DELIVER, the mean placebo-corrected difference between baseline and month 8 among survivors, 2.4 points. Now recall that an increase in 5 points is considered clinically meaningful. So if there was an improvement in quality of life, it is modest. Well, my comments, from a regulatory standpoint, DELIVER was a positive trial. Sure, it was positive. But when used in patients with preserved ejection fraction, the SGLT2 inhibitors are low-value drugs. Now, they wouldn't be low value if they cost as much as, say, furosemide, but at their current cost, they could not possibly be high-value drugs. And I know there are some doctors who are emotional about this class of drugs. And if I had a patient with HFpEF who also had a creatinine of 1.6 and or type 2 diabetes, I would absolutely use an SGLT2 inhibitor. But in the absence of diabetes or CKD, how can you justify the cost of a tablet that has been shown to reduce only one of many types of hospitalization and have no effect on CV death or all-cause mortality? What's more, it's totally normal in medicine for a drug class to have differential benefit, harm, and value properties depending on the condition. Aspirin, for instance, is going to be a lot more net beneficial in patients who've had lacunar strokes and or coronary disease and stents than it would be in a primary prevention patient. When regulatory authorities approve a drug for any indication, it provides a tailwind for its use. And I know some of the purists who listen won't like this, but I believe part of the job of a modern-day clinician is the parsimonious use of healthcare resources. And as an addendum, just this morning, before I taped the podcast, I saw a tweet that led me to a draft document from NICE, one of the UK governing bodies, saying that they would not recommend use of either EMPA or DAPA for patients with preserved or mildly reduced ejection fraction. And in that document, which is still open for comment, the authors felt that it is, quote, not clear whether the drugs reduce the likelihood of dying from either any cause or from cardiovascular causes in this setting, and there are, quote unquote, uncertainties in the modeling of the economic benefits that the drugs deliver, making cost effectiveness hard to determine. Okay, staying on the HFpEF theme, but changing gears a little bit, I want to make a few comments about my discussion last week on the MyPace trial and the issue of heart rate and beta blockers in patients with heart failure. I have a column forthcoming soon, and in it, I really try to capture the excitement of this moment. My friends, this is a big moment in cardiology. This week, I had the opportunity to set pacing rates in a couple of patients who had sinus node dysfunction and HFpEF and pacemakers, and I had my brain going. I was thinking. I also had a handful of patients who have diastolic dysfunction and HFpEF who were on high-dose beta blocker. Again, for the past 2 decades, I did not have any thoughts about the choices of these drugs, but now I have new thoughts about, well, maybe I should reduce the dose or maybe not use these drugs. The issue of beta blocker and heart rate choices comes up nearly every day. That's what makes this so big. Don't get bogged down in the idea that this is a small little select pacing trial from one center. This is about more than just pacing. It's about heart rate and physiology in these patients. And also, I received a fair number of direct messages and text messages saying that they've been avoiding beta blockers for years in patients with HFpEF. So not everyone, I guess, has had this big blind spot. I hope that you read my column on the heart.org Medscape Cardiology when it comes out. It'll be out soon. Please leave comments and let's get a discussion going on this. And if any HFpEF academics accidentally happen onto this podcast, I hope you are already planning trials on beta blocker withdrawal and trials replicating the MyPace study. Okay, next topic is stroke and AFib, and it's a big, important topic. I am not a stroke neurologist, but I like to play one. The EP service at our place is often asked to see post-stroke patients to weigh in on antithrombotic and AF monitoring decisions. But before seeing the patient, we always, and I mean always, visit the neuroradiologist, not by Zoom or by phone, but in person, like in the old days when you went to the film library and had to get the films and then waited in line to speak with a radiologist with your films. Now, there was an important presentation made at the International Stroke Conference in Dallas this week. Journalist Sue Hughes, as always, has excellent coverage of the latest data from the STROKE-AF trial. As I tell you about this trial, remember Mandrola's first rule of critical appraisal, and that is Is the purpose of this study marketing of a product, or is the purpose of the study to truly ask an important scientific question? So stroke AFib was first published in JAMA in 2021. This was a randomized trial, nearly 500 patients who had had stroke from a large or small vessel atherosclerosis. So these are patients who normally get antiplatelet and statin therapy. One group in stroke AF was randomized to an ILR made by Medtronic, the sponsor of the study. One group got usual care. Now, guess what the primary endpoint was? Guess. No, it was not recurrent stroke or death or bleeding. The primary endpoint was detection of AFib lasting more than 30 seconds. And with absolutely zero surprise, AF was detected in 12% in the ILR arm versus 2% in the control arm. Hazard ratio was like 7x. And this data was similar to the Crystal AF study, which studied patients with cryptogenic stroke, and Crystal AF also found much more atrial fibrillation with loop recorders versus standard Holter monitoring in patients who had had stroke of unknown causes. Now, you can make an argument that when you have a stroke with an unknown cause, there's no large or small vessel atherosclerosis. At least looking for atrial fib in these patients is a more reasonable proposition than looking for it in patients who've already had a stroke from atherosclerosis. At this week's International Stroke Congress, we learned data on the 3-year follow-up of stroke AF. Now recall, stroke AF enrolled patients who were in their late 60s, and these patients had a mean CHA2DS2-VASc score of 5, and they had just had a vascular stroke, atherosclerotic-related stroke. And after 3 years of monitoring, the rate of detected AFib had risen to 21.7% in the continuous monitoring arm versus 2.4% in the control arm. So the hazard ratio, which was 7x at 1 year, is now 10x at 3 years. The presenting author, who disclosed financial relationships with Medtronic, said, quote, "This shows that 30 days of monitoring with an external patch is not sufficient to exclude the presence of AFib, and this really argues for a strategy of immediate insertion of cardiac monitor placement if your goal is to look for AFib," end quote. Now, Sue Hughes remains one of the smartest journalists I've ever met, and right after that quote, her next section in the news story is subtitled, "Is this clinically relevant AFib?" And of course, that is the $64,000 question. Our senior author, who recommended immediate insertion of the $10,000 monitor in stroke patients, had to acknowledge the truth. That is that no one knows whether treating device-detected AFib is warranted. In fact, only 2/3 of the patients who had AFib detected in the study had an episode of AFib that lasted more than an hour, so they're picking up a lot of short-duration AFib. Senior author went on to say, quote, "AFib lasting more than 1 hour crosses the threshold for most practitioners I know to feel confident in treating the patient with anticoagulation. If it was symptomatic AFib, this wouldn't even be a question," end quote. Well, in the EP world, that is not at all the consensus. Our consensus is that no one knows. But we like to cite a sub-study of the ASSERT study, that first author Van Gelder, European Heart Journal, 2017, and that sub-study of ASSERT found that nearly all of the risk of device-detected AFib occurred in patients with greater than 24 hours of arrhythmia, and I'll cite that study. Now, my comments. Before I tell you about the tension I feel in this situation, let's also set out that there's a lot of added complexity brought up by the stroke AF trial. That's because here the authors propose searching for AFib in patients who have had an atherosclerotic source of their stroke. And since that is the case, they're going to be taking aspirin or clopidogrel. Now you search for AFib, and if you find it, you aren't just talking about adding oral anticoagulation alone, say, as you would be in a patient with stroke of unknown causes. You're talking about adding an oral anticoagulant to a patient who's already on an antiplatelet drug, and that combination substantially increases the rate of major bleeding, which will be a headwind towards net benefit. So the net benefit in this situation is far from certain. This is not an easy call. I think a better trial, if the authors and the sponsor wanted to answer the real question, would have been to behave like, say, Richard Whitlock and the McMaster's group did in the LEOS 3 trial, which was appendage closure versus no closure after heart surgery. They didn't measure any surrogate outcomes. They measured stroke. So HFpEF is a much better trial if you randomize patients to a loop recorder or standard care and then measured stroke or bleeding, not 30 seconds of AFib. Then we'd see if this lucrative strategy of placing loop recorders in post-stroke patients benefit patients as much as it does doctors, hospitals, and ILR makers. Now to the tension I feel. And here's the thing. I'm not an industry scold. Industry makes great products. The ILR, for instance, can be a great device. I've used it. It has changed care in some patients for the good, no doubt. And this is true of many things industry makes for us. Better EP catheters, better pacemakers, better ICDs. But it can go too far, way too far. In the same way, I rail against the use of SGLT2 inhibitors in low-value situations. It's also important to rail against the low-value use of loop recorders. And in the device's case, it could be even worse, right? Did you know, for instance, that in addition to the $10,000 upfront price tag of these things, patients are billed every 30 days for a download of their data? I mean, these little things are like money printing machines for doctors' practices and hospital practices. And I'd be fine with all that. Making money is not a problem if we had trial-level data showing that in some group of patients, the device leads to better outcomes, not better picking up of a surrogate marker. Final comment, and then I'll move on. Consider, for instance, what you would find if you put loop recorders in patients in their late 60s and had elevated CHA2DS2-VASc scores, like in stroke AF, but these patients were in the hospital for a UTI, or orthopedic surgery, or a gallbladder, or you just pick the same kind of patients coming out of Costco. If you put loop recorders in these patients, you're going to find AFib. Well, then what are you going to do? That's why we need treatment studies. We have enough detection studies. I think we need studies looking at what happens when we treat these patients. And fortunately, there are 2 ongoing trials looking at DOACs in subclinical AFib. This is called the NOAA trial and the Artesia trials. And those will definitely be practice-influencing trials. Okay, final topic today is exercise as medicine again. I'm sorry. JAMA Internal Medicine has a research letter from a group in Shanghai, China. They present 10-year follow-up of an exercise randomized controlled trial. That's good, 10-year follow-up. The trial is quite simple. Patients who had central obesity, of which we have a lot of here in the southeastern United States. They had 3 arms: vigorous exercise, moderate exercise, and standard of care. The primary endpoint was incident diabetes. At the end of 12 months, active exercise intervention, all patients were encouraged to continue with healthy lifestyle and moderate intensity aerobic exercise. And this report was actually a long-term report. Patients were followed for 2 years and 10-year visits to assess the incidence of type 2 diabetes and also the changes in body weight, waist circumference, and the metabolic risk factors. And they found that the risk of diabetes was reduced by 49% in the vigorous aerobic exercise group, by 53% in the moderate aerobic exercise group compared with the non-exercise group. These were statistically significant. Now, noteworthy in this trial was that the only focus was on exercise. Unlike other diabetes prevention studies, this group did not combine diet or lifestyle interventions, so it was all related to the exercise. And my comments, okay, I know this is a small, unblinded trial with surrogate endpoints. It's not going to be a practice-changing paradigm in medicine. But I'm sorry, if you listen to this podcast, I'm going to cover these sorts of trials because one of my strongest biases is that doctors underuse exercise as medicine. Many of my patients, AFib patients, defibrillator patients, are retired, and many don't exercise. I look them square in the eyes and tell patients that a daily regimen of some sort of exercise is like a heart pill, or a diabetes pill, or a blood pressure pill, or surely an AFib pill. I tell patients that if they care about health, they should carve out 15 to 30 minutes a day to do some sort of exercise. And I emphasize todos los días, every day, or at least every day that they eat. And I say that golf doesn't count. If you like to play golf, go do your exercise before golf. And I specify, I'm not talking about training. They don't need to go to a gym, though they can. They don't need to do CrossFit or speed training or get shelled on Zwift like I do. Patients just need to do something physical and sustained for themselves every day. And here's the thing I find. Some people flip. They start doing it. The exercise as pill frame sometimes works. And as it was in the trial from Shanghai, these habits can stick for years. Okay, the final topic is just a brief note about ACC is coming up in a few weeks. This weekend, I will work on my ACC preview. If you know of great studies or if you've done some great studies and you think I might want to see them, let me know. As journalists, we focus on the late breakers and the featured science, and that means we often miss things that are important that are off the main stage, and don't be afraid to promote your own work. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. And remember, friends, if you like this podcast, please give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use, or write us a brief 1-sentence or 2-sentence review. These things go a long way to helping others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the heart.org Medscape Cardiology. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.